Will they love me when I leave? That's the question that C.W. Smith asked himself, and he's written a book about that, about being a weekend father and staying connected to his children, even though he was divorced. Alberta, you had a question.
Yes, I wanted to know how your children responded when they heard that you were going to get divorced, and whether or not they felt that they took on some of the responsibility for the divorce, for I know a lot of children do blame themselves when their parents get separated.
I'm not sure the extent to which they blame themselves, but they are twins, but they reacted very differently. My son was very angry outwardly and showed it. He pelted some neighbors' houses with eggs, and he acted up in school, and he talked back to the teachers, and he had not, prior to that, been a behavioral problem at all. He had difficulty concentrating in his schoolwork. He tended to indulge in all kinds of these sort of pieces of vandalism that he had never done before. And my daughter was very quiet. And we thought, well, she's accepted this. You know, this is kind of serenity. She's kind of riding with the situation. And so we tried to get my son into counseling. He was so angry that he didn't want to be counseled. He would just say, I'm not the one who needs counseling. I'm not the one who's getting divorced. You're getting divorced, you know. It's your problem, not mine, but it's not sleeping there. And I think that I tried to minimize the effect that it would have on them, only to discover that it had a tremendous effect on them, and I was not quite prepared for the extent to which it did affect them adversely.
I remember 10 years ago when my kids were 7 and 8, and I was going through the divorce. The youngest one, I was living in San Francisco.
It was his problem. So my son, therefore, I think, tended to accept the situation ultimately a little better than my daughter, and she slid into a deep depression, and she was hospitalized for a depression about 3 years after the divorce. And
she got into drugs as well.
Yeah, she was treating herself with street drugs for her depression, and she had to be hospitalized. So I think they had two very different reactions, immediate reactions, and two different post-reactions to this.
How did that make you feel? Didn't that give you tremendous guilt?
Yeah, certainly. It made me feel horrible. I think that one of the things that happens to you at first is that when you're getting ready to leave a marriage is you say that, oh, it's not going to affect my children. I see lots of children around, and you know, their parents are divorced, and they seem to be doing just fine, so my children will be okay. I'll just be across the street. I just won't be sleeping there. I'll see them every afternoon, or I'll call them every day, and it'll just be like I'm there. And I think that I tried to minimize the effect that it would have on them, only to discover that it had a tremendous effect on them, and I was not quite prepared for the extent to which it did affect them adversely. A lot of weight and had a lot of illnesses, and I finally got some counseling and was better able to deal with it. But I think one of the mistakes that people in our situation make is that we tend to presume that everything bad that happens to our children happens because of the divorce, when we tend to go for our own jugular. So if something happens in the school, you say, oh, it must be because they went through this divorce and I did this horrible thing to them. And one of the things I learned when my daughter was in the hospital, I went to a group, and I found out that all kinds of parents have all kinds of difficulty with children, that adolescence is a tough time for kids. And I found out that divorce can certainly be a contributory factor to these kinds of depression and illnesses and difficulties, but it's not necessarily a necessary or even sufficient cause for them. And I think it almost amounts to a kind of arrogance and an egotism to always be saying, oh, my child's problem is because of something I did, and the kids begin to resent this. Well, what happens to me is not necessarily something because something you did to me, and they begin to resent it. But I think you have to learn to sort out what problems they're having comes from that divorce and what problems.
And I think you have to include them in the decision-making process. They don't have to know the reasons necessarily for the divorce, but you've got to allow them to grieve.
Sure.
And you've got to allow them to be part of the process, because you're still going to be their father, you're still going to be their mother. And so many of us used our kids as weapons.
That's the most terrible thing.
And getting back at each other.
Paul, you're sitting there in the front row shaking your head.
Yes.
Does this ring clear?
Yes, it does.
Is it where you'd like it to be?
I think it gets better because they were 9.5 when I got divorced, and they're both 17 now. And I think a lot of the problems I have with them right now have to do with the fact that I'm a parent and they're teenagers. And my son actually came to live with me for 2 years between the time he was 15 until just very recently.
Was that his choice?
Yes, it was, and I really welcomed it, and I was very happy to have that opportunity to sort of exercise my fathering muscles there with him on the spot. But I think I overdid it, which is maybe why he went back to live with his mother.
What do you mean? What do you mean overdid it? Too strict?
Well, I just felt like I had to control this. I kept thinking of him as a child, and it was sort of, immediately I had this 15-year-old directly in my home. I kept thinking I have to direct all his activities, and I have to, I was overbearing, I think, authoritarian and overbearing, and probably much more too like the heavy father instead of more like a friend and a guide.